I say, since this is the first time we've done this, that I welcome your feedback on this. If there are ways you think I could restructure the lectures, there's still time for us to produce some new ones. Oh, and that reminds me of one other thing. At least twice a week, we'll have video Q&A. So I want you to send me questions by email or through the discussion forums about questions that need some further discussion. That way I can put up a new video at least twice a week that provides drop-in Q&A. It's the best we can do to have a face-to-face conversation that, of course, online we can't quite have. So expect those, and I welcome your questions as a way to structure that part of the class as well. All right, with that introduction, I want to spend a little time now talking about main topics. I've mentioned them in overview above. I think we're finished with the sort of overview of the technicalities of the class. Now I want to talk a little bit more about some of the methods, and really we're now into what you might think of as a lecture, but one that's intended to give you an overview. So let's think about what are the core topics in surveys and polls. By the way, I'll be using the term polls and surveys interchangeably. We can talk a little bit more about differences between them. For the most part, I think the differences are semantic rather than important. So what are the three components of a poll or a survey? The sample, the data collection, and the analysis and interpretation. Those, you could combine them in different ways, but I think those capture the three most important elements. So let's start with sampling. Sampling, as I've mentioned, is the best understood mathematically because it's actually possible to develop theorems and proofs about how sampling from a population can produce a set of data which accurately estimate population characteristics, even though you only interview a tiny fraction of the whole population. This is a kind of topic that comes up at pollster.com not infrequently. We'll have someone who wants to write in and argue that there's no way that a sample of 1,000 people can possibly accurately represent 300 million people, and so all of polling, all of surveys are just bunk. Now, that does happen, but it's hard to respond to simply because it's so wrong. There are books, I will wave some around in the next lecture, that are set out the mathematics of this, set out the proofs. This is really an area where we have tremendous knowledge about how sampling works and why it works and why it's justifiable. And so when critics say that surveys are inherently wrong, they simply don't know what they're talking about. We could send them to a class, maybe this one, maybe the sampling class down in statistics. But we really do have excellent theories of sampling. Let's just mention a couple of those. The most basic, but also the best illustration of what sampling is like, is simple random sampling. The idea is simple. Suppose we had a list of all of the people or cases in a population that we wanted to sample. In simple random sampling, we give every person in that population an equal and known chance of being selected into our sample. If we do that, then we can prove, it's a very simple proof that I'll show you in the next sampling lecture, a very simple proof that shows that a simple random sample will produce with surprising accuracy for a surprising small sample estimates of the population proportions or means of some variable of interest that we not only can say will be accurate over repeated sampling, but we can also estimate how accurate they will be for a single collection of, say, 1,000 cases. The answer there turns out to be about plus or minus 3.1%, by the way, but we'll have to talk about why that happens in technical detail in a later lecture. The point here is that simple random sampling is a fundamental basis for understanding why a sample of 1,000 people or 600 people or 1,500 people can be a good estimate of a population that is, in principle, infinitely large. In practice for the United States, 300 million people, but in India or China, for example, with over 1 billion people, the same sample size could still be just as accurate. That's something that's counterintuitive and one that we'll have to spend some time justifying. But by the time we're finished with the sampling portions of the class, you will understand what that is, what the theory is, why it works, and you'll have some practical experience in designing and selecting samples so that when you do your own data collection, you'll be able to take those techniques and apply them. The second major part of surveys is data collection. And here I want to expand the notion of data collection. It's partly the survey interview, the collection of the data through asking questions and recording answers, but data collection has other elements to it as well. For example, survey non-response. When you sample a person, you call them on the telephone, but they say, oh, very politely, no thank you, I prefer not to respond to your survey. That is more a data collection problem than it is a sampling problem, and we'll talk at some length about the issues that come up due to non-response, non-coverage, and other kinds of participation-related problems. But data collection also covers the issues of question wording, question order, format. What kinds of questions did you ask before you ask a particular question? And just give you an example of that. In a well-known phenomenon known as priming, earlier questions that raise a particular subject then make that subject more accessible when later questions are asked. So a classic example of this is a study that first asks about the economy, of a fairly straightforward question: how do you think the economy is doing today? Is it doing excellent, good, fair, or poor? A little bit later, the survey asks, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? Now, study after study after study have shown that if you first prime the economy, when people answer questions about the president and his job approval, they use those economic considerations more than they would if earlier they had not been asked about the economy. If earlier we had asked environmental questions, we can show that later the presidential approval question is more influenced by the respondents' opinions about the environment than they would be if we'd asked about the economy, and so on. These fundamental elements of psychology and the psychology of the survey response are elements that drive every survey and that influence every survey. They're also inescapable. Unless you were going to ask a survey that with exactly one question, there is always an issue of order in the survey. What questions are asked before which other questions? We'll take up that subject in some detail.